everyone, welcome back to a brand new episode on the CollegeCrafts YouTube channel, and I'm sorry for the poor upload schedule. Again, school, work, in this case I had to move into my new place, and yeah, so sorry about that. Today we're going to be building a controller sign. Have never really done detail woodworking before, so this one was quite a struggle, so I would truly appreciate if you guys would drop a like and subscribe to this channel. It really helps take off. So yeah, if you guys can do that, let's get into this. To start this project, I grabbed a notebook and sketched out the design of the controller sign to see what I would need to build it. After I knew how big I wanted it, I grabbed the spine pieces of a pallet board, which is what I refer to as the section that holds the top and bottom together to create the pallet. And I flattened down the faces using a planer of each side that was going to be glued together. I then cut all the boards to the desired length that I wanted them to be and glued them together. After gluing them together, I did my best to clamp it together. As you can see, it was kind of a sketchy setup, but you know what? In the long run, it worked. I then gave the surface a rough sanding. I wasn't going for anything pretty. I was just making sure that I would be able to draw on the top without running into issues with a rough surface. So it was just a quick sand so that when I used a pencil, I wasn't running into any problems. The next step was to draw the dimensions that I had put on the notebook and copy it onto the wood with the actual dimensions that I would be using. This one, you just kind of take your time. As you can see, I did it freehand, and it actually turned out looking pretty good after making the lines a bit darker and also putting in where all the joysticks, the buttons, and where the bumpers are gonna go. Now I had to cut out the sign, and to accomplish this I used a combination of a circle saw, a jigsaw, and a sander, using the circle saw and the jigsaw to cut on the outside of the line to get it close, and sanding the rest of the way down. Now it was time to create the holes for where all the buttons and the joysticks are going to go, and to accomplish this I drilled out a hole for each button, and in the case of the plus, 4 holes in each peak, and using a jigsaw to cut out the rest of the plus, and a jigsaw to cut out the rest of the big circles for the joystick. And for the buttons, I just decided to use a Dremel tool to widen it up to the area that I wanted it to be. And in the case of the plus button and the joysticks, I would eventually use the Dremel to get it to the specific dimensions that I wanted it to be. This took me a really long time, so I'm gonna go over briefly what the design of this is meant to be. I didn't want it to be a specific Xbox, PS4 thing. I wanted a little bit of a mix of everything. So as you can see, it has the Xbox shape. I mean, that's probably the most prominent form factor out of any other controller design. And then as you can see, I implemented a little bit of the PS4 design with the massive pad on the top, and a little bit of Nintendo with the 4 squares on the very top of the controller, each one resembling each player. Now it was time for the really difficult part, the thing that I've never really done before. It is the shaping of wood. And to accomplish this, I used first my sander to really get close to where the pencil marks were so that it was in perfect form, and then using an angle grinder that I stole from my brother to shape the wood into the curvature that you would expect a controller to have. You know, if it was like what you saw before where it was very square, that wouldn't be the most comfortable controller. So it was time to start shaping, and this one I kind of just felt out more or less. Like, there was no preemptive shape that I was trying to achieve. But in the end, I was really proud of how it turned out, and honestly had quite a bit of fun doing it. You know, something that I found out in all the designing that I did and all the work that I put into this, I just realized after hours and hours and days of work that I didn't even have a home button in my design. So I decided to just wing it and put a home button in there, as well as a charging port. I knew that there was going to be RGBs in this, so that's where I was going to have the cord come out of the sign. So I drilled a inch hole for the home button and started to drill like a Type C sort of input style. for the cable. And as you can see, I have already started hollowing out the inside of the controller sign because if I didn't, one, it would be extremely heavy, and two, I needed to have RGBs behind it. So this was kind of a win-win situation. I made it a lot lighter and also created a space for the RGBs to be placed in the sign by hollowing it out using the angle grinder. Next, I needed a spot for the RGBs to be placed onto, as well as all the joysticks, the buttons, and all that stuff. So I grabbed a piece of 1/4-inch plywood from a previous build that I did, and I traced around the sign and cut it out using a circle saw and a jigsaw, afterwards sanding it down. After that, we noticed that there were still a lot of gaps in the wood and a lot of holes from where nails used to be, so grabbing some wood putty, we filled in each spot, and while it was drying, I created a deeper groove where the marked out bumpers and pad were, because I wanted some light to come out of there too. So using my Dremel, I followed the line that I had made with pencil so that I could have an easier cutout with the jigsaw later. I then sanded down the entire surface of the wood putty and using my jigsaw cut out the top 2 bumpers and the top middle pad. Now it was time to start finally working on the buttons and all that stuff. The home button is a little bit special because I wanted an epoxy home button because I had some leftover epoxy. So I painted the interior of the home button white to make it more reflective. And while that was drying, I wanted to make some homemade dowels. And to do that, I grabbed a piece of pallet and using a circle saw, I cut the pallet into a strip. And then I grabbed sander and an angle grinder, kind of made it a little round. Then using a screw and a drill, I screwed into the dowel that I had just made, and to make it perfectly round, I stuck it in the drill, spun it with a piece of sandpaper as a makeshift homemade lathe, occasionally test fitting it into the slot that it was going to go into to make sure it was the perfect diameter. I then inserted the dowel into one of the holes that I had made to see how high off the top of the controller I wanted the buttons to extend, marking it there, and then using my miter saw, I cut the dowel into 6 perfect pieces, and then using a Dremel and a piece of sandpaper, rounded off the top of the buttons. And now we had all 6 buttons. Now it was time to work on the epoxy, and to do this I measured out equal parts resin to hardener, and I sat there and I mixed for 5 minutes. After the 5 minutes was up, I duct taped the back of the hole of the home button and poured the epoxy in using a torch and a heat gun to get rid of all of the bubbles. Then I removed the tape, and then I printed off this really cool G that I saw online, and I didn't want it to be a specific color because I didn't want to correlate with any specific brand, so I decided to make it RGB, and this was kind of perfect because as you can see there are 3 sections of this G. So using an X-Acto knife, I cut the G out of the paper, being very careful not to split it, and then I taped the G onto the center of the home button, and then I went from left to right, I went RGB, so I painted red, green, blue in each individual section, and I think it turned out really cool, especially when I put a flashlight behind it. And for those who are confused, the G stands for gamer. And since I wanted it to be glossy, the next step for me was to put a protective coating of epoxy on the outside so that there would be a little bit of a bump on the home button, and it would also, again, be a glossy G. As you can see, obviously it spilled out, so I took a Dremel and some sandpaper and went around the circle until it looked like a home button. Now, this was the part that I was truly dreading. It was time to work on the joysticks and the plus button. The plus button I wasn't too worried about, but the joysticks, yeah, I was really confused. So I took a 2-inch in diameter dowel that I had saved up from when I built a cord winder, and I printed out a perfectly scaled version of the joystick, and using the paper as a template, I used my Dremel tool to slowly carve out a joystick, and I had to do this 2 times, of course, for the 2 joysticks. And once the joystick was done, I gave it a hand sand so that everything would be nice and smooth. Next up was to make the plus button, and to do that I again printed out a scaled up version of the plus and cut out the form, and I taped the form to a 1-inch thick piece of pallet board and traced around it, and then using a jigsaw cut the plus out using a Dremel to shave off the sides, as well as carve out a better hole for the plus to fit into. Now it was time to tackle something that really annoyed me. As you can see, there's a big gap between the wall of the joystick and the wall of the slot that it's supposed supposed to fit into. And I wanted the wall of the sign to slightly come over the joystick so the light will still get through from the RGBs, but you won't be seeing the back of the sign at all. To do this, I grabbed one of the scrap pieces of plywood that I had and drew some circles so that the joystick would still be able to fit through, but the circles are smaller than the base. And then I also cut a circle on the outside, one that would go past the wall of the sign so that it would rest on top. And then I cut a notch in the bottom of the O that I had just made so that it would rest like a shelf on the outer rim of the sign and still slightly go over the joystick. And then I used my Dremel and a sander to make it sloped so then it would look like a part of the sign. Then I glued the bottom, put it into place, and put some weight on it. Next up was the player indicator that resembles Nintendo, and the first thing I did was take my Dremel tool and cut a much deeper oval so that when I put stencil paper, which is going to act as a diffuser, into the slot, it'll appear much closer to the top of the sign, because I didn't want the white part looking too sunken in because that just didn't look very clean. So I used the Dremel to dig deep, and then I cut 2 ovals out of the stencil paper that was approximately the size of the oval that I had dug into the sign, and I layered them so that there would be more diffusion, and I used some super glue to stick that into place. Speaking of diffusion, I decided to spray paint the entire inside of the sign white, so I taped up the home button so I wouldn't get white paint on that, and I spray painted the plywood white as well as the inside of the sign, and this will allow the light to reflect a lot more. I then hand painted the rims of all of the walls of the sign itself so that the light would bounce a lot better off of that and it would look a lot more uniform, and I think it ended up looking insanely good. And now it's time for the big moment, the moment that I had worked so hard for. It was time to start assembling. So I put some spacers at the bottom of joysticks and the plus buttons and the base of the PS4 pad so that everything would be level and flush. And then I put the top of the sign on the plywood and then set all of the pieces into place with the glue at the bottom and waited for it to dry. After the glue had dried, I stained all of the buttons a golden pecan color, and then I laid all of the RGBs down using super glue to make sure that all of the joints were permanently stuck, and also making sure that the cable would exit through the quote-unquote charging port that I put in the bottom of the sign. After that was done, I stained the body of the sign as well as the upper bumpers and the PS4 pad a dark walnut stain, which looked beautiful with the golden pecan stain that the buttons were. While I was staining, I was being careful to not go over the epoxy, even though that doesn't really matter all that much. It can leave a little bit of a mark, and I was always wiping off the excess stain to make sure there was no drip marks. Then the final step was to glue up all the points of contact between the top of the sign and the plywood and clamp them together, and then it was finally done. Well, everyone, there it is, right next to "Do beer runs count as exercise?" and "Dog beers I've only had one," and Ryan's Man Cave, "Good times, good friends, cold beer, good food, open 24 hours" sign. And I think it makes a really nice addition, and it was a lot of fun to make. Really, really challenging. Took me many months. So that's why I would truly appreciate if you guys would like and subscribe. And the best part about the sign is it didn't cost me a thing. I already had RGBs lying around the house. Pallets are free. We had the paper from another project that we did, and obviously the only thing I used was, glue's the only thing attaching this, which I also had on hand. So yeah, it didn't cost me a penny, and I think it looks great, and I'm really thrilled with how it turned out. Again, would really appreciate the like and subscribe. See you guys in the next time.